Alright, and we're live. Greetings, everybody. We are back with another episode of badly recorded, badly written Doge audiobook. Now, hopefully today we're not going to miss another fucking 20 minutes of the footage, because I'm hopefully not going to accidentally mash the fucking pause button. So, well, here's hoping. Anyway, let's get straight into it. We're on page 22 now. I believe last time we missed like page 13 to 320 or something like that. But hopefully that's not going to happen this time. Anyway, on we go. A new age of warfare. Nice concept art here. Hastily shoved together inside GIMP because I realized that I needed a single art piece of this thing. So, pardon the blank spaces. Anyway, regardless, the Revolutia Doze class are a class of ship-fit battlecruisers armed with guns and missiles and designed to fill in for the larger battleships where their greater capabilities are less necessary. Anyway, we are directly entering a Romlemnov POV shot, which is of course going to be our head honcho Imperial faction leader. So that's always nice. Do pardon me if the accent is weird today. I think I might be fucking it up, but such is life. And it does change. Like every single fucking day. It does its own thing. Anyway, no, stop fucking going through distractions. Read the fucking book like you're supposed to. Romlemnov, Vladimirovich Palace, Shiberkonivov Station. 4th November, year 92. 1:39 p.m. The Tsar watched as Shubrensky shuffled into the room, grim-faced. Sir, it appears that the Reds have deployed nuclear weapons on their own lands. The majority of Kato forces in the area have been wiped out. He did a double take. Nuclear weapons in their own territory. Surely the Reds had gone mad. He supposed it did make sense when you thought about it. They had landed far from any areas of value, and the Reds had greater issues than a patch of irradiated permafrost. This would prove a major setback in the invasion plans. Still, they couldn't afford to delay the landings any further. The whole affair was already extremely time-sensitive, pivoting on their ability to establish forward bases before the Red reinforcements could arrive and crush their airheads. Should I prepare our warhead for launch, sir? Tsar leaned forward, putting a ball to his snout, seemingly deep in thought. No, not now. We cannot afford to play our hand. Not yet. Doge, fix your fucking typo. Stop being bad. Anyway, the Reds will see us coming. Their radars and satellites will see to that. But, fucking Doge, this is the second time in this one fucking paragraph. But our allies, the Katos, should be able to fight alone for some time longer, given your support. Shabransky nodded, saluting before walking out of the room. The Tsar relaxed, sinking back into the chair. He pawed at the sheaf of papers before him, glancing down at the stack of reports. The vanguard of their forces was ready, but their support was far from prepared. Perhaps they were better trained than both the Karo and Red forces combined, and perhaps their equipment was far more advanced than anything the opposition fielded. But even then, their force was still minuscule, their numbers far from sufficient for the war they were fighting. Even the space fleet, pride of the Empire, remained woefully small compared to its Red counterpart. The navigation computer that they had captured from the Reds had been booted off the network a few hours ago, and despite their best attempts, they had been unable to get back online. Some steps had been taken to boost recruitment, drawing ever more Doges into the Empire's armed forces. But still, there were only so many eligible candidates for selection, and the Imperial force would likely never be able to match its peers in number. Instead, then, they would have to strive for quality over quantity, whether in training, arms, or tactics. They would have to perform at their finest to win the war, and with it, reclaim their homeland. Imperial-funded resistance cells continued to crop up around former Great Gibelandia, a small number even appearing in the Shibvid hinterland itself, even if they were quashed long before the Empire could hope to make contact. But if all went to plan, what was left of these forces would eventually stage a coordinated assault in tandem with major Imperial deployments, one great bid to destroy the Reds to reclaim what was theirs. Doge, fix your fucking typos. Coordinate. What the fuck is a coordinate assault? Doge, get your shit together. Anyway. But that was exactly the issue. If he couldn't predict the future, Only hope it all went to plan. So, typos aside, it was what it was. I quite like the sort of like geopolitical rambling passages more, they're just sort of fun. But, of course, I'm not the best at writing them, so, take them as you will. Mlemskovich, Imperial Cruiser Zarovich. Fuck's sake, Doge! Mlemskovich, Imperial Cruiser Zarovich. 11:92 a.m. Hold on. Doge. You have gotten back in fucking time 2 hours. Was this intended, Doge? Or were you just a fucking... What the fuck is 11:92 hours? Doge, are you high? uh, what the fuck does it mean, Doge? What the fuck is an 11:92 hours? Anyway, critical Doge brain failures aside. The Admiral stared nervously at the screens before him, panting slightly as he did. The ship hummed quietly as it stood its vigil behind the asteroid, the room uncomfortably hot. Their destruction of the enemy vessel had of course been followed by a vicious red counterattack, the Imperial fleet quickly breaking up and vanishing into the nooks and crannies of the asteroid belt, the rings of rubble mapped out by the drones which constantly worked the Empire's mining operation. He found their charts somewhat inaccurate. This section of the belt had run dry some time ago, but the newest maps of the area were between 1 to 5 years old. And with the asteroids being what they were, they had shifted nearly completely, leaving them with only the spotters posted to the ship's various observation decks and cameras. They couldn't risk activating their LiDAR arrays. Broadcasting was akin to suicide with the enemy this close. Supposedly there was a red mining platform in the area, but the field had been played out long ago, and any hostile miners would likely have moved to greener pastures years ago. More concerning was the swarm of scouts that the pursuing red battleship had sent after them. Even with numbers, they stood no chance against the red flagship. Taking down the enemy cruiser had proven enough for an undertaking. With the battleship's superior armor and redundancy, he doubted they could even scratch it. Fortunately for them, however, the enemy scouts were slow, taking their time as they scanned their surroundings, beaming back findings to their mothership. He hoped that this would leave them enough of an opening to get out of this. He supposed that if all else failed, he could always give the order to open fire, but that would take time he couldn't waste, so he wanted to get out of this. The ship was running at low power, shutters closed over its many radiators, trying to mask its thermal signature. It had proven effective so far, but it had the somewhat annoying side effect of the ship's interior itself turning into a giant heatsink, pushing their surroundings somewhat above comfortable temperatures. But their patience seemed to have paid off, the red behemoths turning their scans some other factor. What the fuck is some other factor, Doge? I'm pretty sure this was supposed to say sector, but Doge can't fucking type. So. The interior was sweltering, ever more heat getting pent up within the hull. He ordered the radiators opened, releasing flares of heat into the space around the ship, heat pumps working overtime as the ship cooled down. He pondered his options, resolving to return to Kornivov, the endless stream of charts and numbers before him slowly climbing as the ship's reactors and engines reached full output. The war was still young, but the Imperial crews had been put through their paces, and they deserved their honor, if nothing else. Again, typos aside, nothing special about the chapter. I mean, section is you can't really call these chapters; they're way too short. But they are things. I think things is about the best way you can put it. Anyway, Srebrenicki, Kikidi Slavny Doz, 12-13 hours. Okay, so the timeline is sort of weird here. So, the Tsar, just hold on. Was the date just screwed up here? No, the date was not screwed. Okay, so shit just happens at like 1 a.m. I mean, like 1 p.m. through this entire section. And at this. And so, spontaneously, it goes to 11 a.m. on the same day. Which I mean, okay, time jump, yeah, okay, it sort of makes sense. Of course, the 11:92 hours does not make sense, though. Why the fuck do you think there's fucking 92 minutes in a day? But, yeah, that aside, I suppose it is workable. Anyway, contact, bearing 259, unknown signature. Shubnitsky jolted awake. Acceleration pushing him further into the chair as the ship gained speed, engines spewing plasma and charged particles. The field cleared around them, the last of the asteroids bouncing off the spacecraft's hull. He blinked, clearing his eyes as he looked towards the panoramic screens around him, a lone vessel. He was unsure what it was, a sharp prow jutted proudly from a boxy hull, a bizarre dish-shaped superstructure covered in heavily raked radiator stacks. He gave the order to fire, waiting for the inevitable electric crack as the supercapacitors discharged their energy. But the light show never happened. "Sir, we can't get a lock." "What do you mean you can't get a lock?" Shubnitsky asked in dismay. "The ship isn't showing on our sensor, sir." "Switch to manual targeting." "There, sir." Shubnitsky watched from the camera feed as the turrets turned into place, myriad barrels focusing in on one spot. But just as the guns were ready to fire, their sensors were pelted with massive spikes of energy. He gave the fire order anyway, the guns blazing away with abandon at an unseen foe. Just as fast as they had come, the spikes died down, leaving nothing but empty space before them. Toward it once again, he thought dejectedly as the battleship turned back towards home. It would be a long trip back, and an even longer meeting trying to justify their consistent failures. Barkov, Capsule 7, somewhere in space. Date unknown. Time unknown. Darkness, emptiness, silence, blackness. The scientists and stargazers could call it all they wanted. It stared through the window at him, unblinking, always watching. He stared back. Nothing. He was hoping they would find something this time, but wasn't that the same hope that was there the last 20 times he had looked? The last 20 times he hadn't seen anything. He breathed a shallow breath. The air was thinning. Even with the carbon dioxide scrubbers working away at full capacity, there was only so much oxygen in the tanks, and their pressure had dropped to nearly atmospheric levels. They didn't have long left, not without help. They had only a few days of food and water remaining, even without considering the dwindling air supplies. Was it a bad way to die? He ranked it at the top of his list. He reckoned the rest of the station did too. He dropped the topic. As true as they might prove in the near future, prophecies of doom wouldn't do them any good. But it kept creeping back into his mind, over and over, like some damned parasite he could never rid himself of. Thought of dying in a claustrophobic pod, suffocating with 5 others, perhaps starving, perhaps dehydrated, frozen for the rest of time as they drifted through space. Stop it. What? We all know what you're thinking. We've all done it. No sense making it worse. Barkov looked towards the source of the noise. Shabrinsky, a fellow guard, one of the few to reach the pods before the advancing Karos forced it to launch. Side note, I'm not sure if I've already fucking used Shabrinsky as a fucking POV character on the other faction. I mean, I guess this is okay. I mean, it's a one-time use sort of like dump character. Like they don't show up anywhere else. They're not a POV character. And I guess it wouldn't be inconceivable for, two people to have the same last name, but like at the same time, it does get rather confusing for like the whole reading thing. Anyway, the lucky few. Perhaps they would have been better off if they all died at the station. A quicker death, perhaps, more painless than suffocating, or starving, or freezing. He curled up further, leaning against the wall of the capsule. It was cold. They had to keep the heating low, what meager power the solar panels generated going largely into broadcasting their distress signal far into space. He closed his eyes, trying to drift into sleep. Save some air, extended the time just a little. And so the capsule drifted aimlessly through space, a forlorn ship sailing for forlorn hopes. They would try to keep movement to a minimum, trying to preserve what air they had, but it would prove a fine balancing act. Move too much, and they'd run out of oxygen far too quickly. Too little, and they may have frozen where they lay. Still, the transponder continued to chatter away, beaming coordinates and information out into the murky dark void, a last hope for rescue that to the survivors may have never come. So, I quite like that paragraph. Paragraph? Dude, get your nomenclature together. Figure out what the fuck you're going to call them and stick with it. Holy shit. Anyway, quite like that bit of the book. I think it was sort of poetic, maybe a bit cliche, but I liked the writing. Remshenkov, northwestern approach, Shipkutsk, 11 November, year 92. 2:19 a.m. The radio sounded, a warbled voice cutting through the din of the constant artillery barrage. Attention, comrades! We have received reports of enemy vehicles in the area. Friendly armor may be unable to respond in the near future. Be prepared to repel attack. Their instructions were clear. They were also less so. Despite their martial superiority, Cairo forces had still managed to force their retreat back to Shipkutsk, and he doubted the appearance of enemy armor was a coincidence. Crush their one pocket of resistance and gain control of the Trans-Siberian. Site of historical battles, main supply hub, but most importantly, it stood to be the last bastion of Soviet forces in the Central East. The guns had been pounding for hours, howitzers, cannon, firing in unison, a single chorus of death and destruction. From the parks, from the fields, from the mountains. Blemchenkov watched as the enemy forces began cresting the hill, distant specks of black and white against the green tint of the night vision. Still too far out for him to hit. But the artillery had no such problems, high explosive plunging into the ground. A flare shot into the sky as the enemy force entered range, the night vision flashing white before the goggles compensated. Pulling the bulky set off, he blinked, eyes adjusting to the constantly changing light. The long-expected enemy tanks began rolling into range. They seemed to be lighter models, nothing close to the great Shubvit heavies he had seen on the parade grounds. An anti-tank gun fired in the near trench, the night sky lighting up with crackles of electricity as the Shubvit lines opened up. The Cairo lines returned fire, shells cratering the ground before the trenches, walking ever closer as the enemy gunners dialed in their guns. Remshenkov ducked as a shell whizzed overhead, slamming into the ground behind him. He got back up, fired another burst in the red-tinged darkness before him. Those to his left and right followed, a constant cacophony of exchanging fire. The enemy infantry closed in, hosing down the Soviet lines with their submachine guns. For each they cut down, two more took their place. Machine guns blazed into the enemy horde, seemingly to little effect. One of the officers stood, blowing their whistle and motioning to retreat, before getting shot through the neck by a catapult. And such was their conundrum. Leave the trench and be shot, or stay and be shot anyway. Not the most appetizing of choices, he mused. The Kairos had almost reached the lip of the trench when he heard the planes flying overhead. Bombs fell from the sky, punching great craters in the advancing enemy. Yet more machine guns joined in the chorus as the orbiting aircraft strafed the Kairos. And the air support they had so yearned for had arrived, not a second too late. Walls of flame crisscrossed the battlefield, fire welling up from the ground as the napalm took flight. He fired a long burst into the Kairos, the barrel of his rifle red hot, recoil point pressing into his shoulder. More of the enemy tanks went up, tall pyres reaching skywards as they punctuated the scene before him. He held down the trigger. Chop, chop, chop. Was that his gun or the man beside him? Kept the trigger down. There were cannons dropping before him. At least that was what it looked like. Chop, 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 chop. Still going? Or had the bolt on his gun locked to the rear long ago? He didn't know. Kept going. And it was over in what felt like 5 minutes. Really, probably closer to 30. Expanded casings and charges littered the trenches, probably easier to step on the pile of those in solid ground at this point. He blinked, the haze of fog cast over the battlefield vanishing as he did. Looked at his rifle, the furniture had melted off. He swore loudly to nobody in particular, except maybe the unit quartermaster, but he was out of earshot anyway. This was going to be a fun one to explain. You know, another one of those swanky, climactic battle scenes. Who doesn't like him, right? Who doesn't like him? Barkarov, Nakkom 2, low planetary orbit. 4:13 a.m. Incompetent fools. He sighed, glancing longingly at the bottle of cheap liquor stored away in the corner. Heaven knew he needed it, though whether for his own sake or to drizzle over the corpse of the cattle war effort he didn't quite know. He had watched in dismay as the far superior cattle forces were effortlessly crushed by the red defenses. The Shibkut's pocket had been successfully cut off from supply by anything short of a great airlift, and the Morons had failed to capitalize even on that. Even with a leadership he put at least incompetent, they should have been able to force at least a small victory, casualties notwithstanding. Instead, they had failed. Very cool, Doge. They had failed at even this. worried by what should have been an exhausted red fence. In his books, this bumped. How the fuck do I even pronounce this? UC-com, I guess? Fuck, like, up to downright suicidal. If only that number had been Imperial regulars, it would have been so much easier if it was, wouldn't it? But if only it would get him nowhere. The Imperial army was still not ready, and what was done was done. He couldn't change the past, only shape the future. He pulled his handheld off his belt, punching in the number sequence he remembered. Hello, and welcome to Ship Fennel's Pie Emporium. May we take your... His face crunched up, baring teeth before he steadied himself, pulled the card out of the pocket. Ah, so that was a 7. He punched the numbers in again, correctly this time. A moment of static, a series of beeps, and then a voice. Slightly accented, perhaps just a bit distorted. Not Imperial, not Cato, and certainly not Red. A free agent of sorts, at least as close as you got these days. Gabran, the Hekdonin. 4:51 a.m. Zivanochi receiving. Good day, Sir Polkovnik. How may I help you today? I believe we may require your assistance. What for? The Keto offense is failed. We are unable to commit our forces at the present moment. Find us somewhere to set down, or better yet, prop up the Keto war effort and leave us out of this entirely. You will be compensated adequately once the war is won. You understand that I cannot work on contingency. We can discuss this once money is on the table. Should you succeed, consider your debts paid to us. Fail us, and you may very well have to repossess that fancy new ship of yours. Of course, you will still be entitled to any red craft you capture along the way. He gulped nervously, sandwiched between two of the system's great powers, his Imperial Playmasters and the ship which they had tasked him with combating. Not exactly his greatest hopes. He'd have to get on the ground too, not just sabotage some power plant or assassinate some mid-level politician, but to pioneer an entire spaceborne landing. Risky. Wouldn't have taken it if he had a choice. But he had been backed into a corner. What had started as a simple way to make a quick buck, all while sticking it to the ship which had annexed his homeland, had quickly turned into a near dependency on the Imperial black budget and all that it accorded him. They seemed to hold all the cards, the Imperials, including the very ship he was currently aboard, the Hekadonin. One of the new Imperial Tsarevich-class cruisers, or so it was told anyway. He'd never seen another of the things before. Built completely off the books, assembled from a most definitely not suspicious order of a spare for every part needed to build a new ship. But they could take it back at any time, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. He had given up freedom of operations for fancy new Imperial toys, and nothing could be done about it now. Except, maybe, the successful completion of this mission. Gabran to all units. We leave in a day. Borkov, Capital 7, somewhere in space. 12th November, year 92. Time unknown. The radio hissed static. Nothing. Time was running out. He glanced toward the pressure gauge across the pod. 11 hours. One of the carbon dioxide scrubbers had given out a day ago. He silently cursed the procurement officer who had approved the system's installation. The other scrubber would last him a few days more, but they'd all run out of oxygen by then anyway. He reached for his frequency knob, gave it another twist, combing through the broadcasts once again. Static. Wait, what was that? He gently twisted the knob over again. There! Spoken word. Shibvetsky Soyuz Broadcasting, requesting identification from any vessels in the area. Unidentified vessels will be boarded and then searched. Borkov reached for the microphone with an enthusiasm he hadn't had in days. Set the device to broadcast with all the power the capsule still had available. Shibvetsky Soyuz, are we glad to see you? He paused to read a string of identification codes. The Soyuz came back on air. Acknowledged, moving into pickup. KKD Shibvetsky Soyuz. 3:34 p.m. The doors cracked open with a pneumatic hiss as the Barkov boarded the larger ship. He took the chance to stretch slightly, a tail thumping against the chamber's walls. Even the airlock chamber in the battleship felt spacious compared to the claustrophobic capsule. Safe at last. The station survivors walked deeper into the ship. Barkov took the chance to look at some of the news bulletins coming through the communication systems. It seemed that the Cados hadn't managed much while he had been away, their advance seemingly having been stopped by the Motherland's stalwart defenders. But the news wasn't all good. In a supposed major engagement, the Union had lost a small number of ships, while the enemy had supposedly paid the price with the loss of yet another vague number of their ships. Of course, nobody knew if any of what they had read was true. That was an open secret. The state propaganda mills had probably been going full tilt since the start of the war. Leaned against the wall, feeling the rhythmic vibrations of the turbines course through the ship. One of the others had managed to strike up a conversation with one of the crew. It seemed the Soyuz hadn't gone into any battle since leaving port, and the battleship was about to rendezvous with the Mlemzimborki class cruiser Shubvarov, which they were to transfer aboard in a few weeks' time when it arrived. But, until then, they were at full liberty to enjoy the larger ship's full accommodations. While not as up-to-date as those on board the newer Slavny Doge or even the smaller Revolutia-class battlecruisers, they still possessed a rather comprehensive set of amenities, all the comforts of a home built into whatever free space they could find aboard the battleship. Unnamed Imperial Commander, Imperial Cruiser Zarevich, 13th November, year 92, 3:18 a.m. Contact, reported the watch officer over the bridge intercom. The Tsarevich had recently redeployed after their last scrape of Red forces, but it seemed they were now due for another meeting. The captain wrestled with the periscope controls, the ship's array of cameras turning to observe the colossus before him. The larger ship quite literally eclipsed them, painted black in some rudimentary attempt at camouflage. A single star was painted on its side, crimson red, marked by streaks and scratches where asteroids, space junk, and any number of other things had bounced off. Shadowit Rautgand, came the voice from behind him. The captain turned, casting a sharp salute toward the figure. The radio console squawked, the communications officer relaying the order to the rest of the force, a trio of Radosny-class missile destroyers. The small squadron lay hidden inside the asteroid field, slowly creeping parallel to the enemy vessel. Spaceborne rocks tugged as the ships pushed them out of their way, stalking their prey in the interstellar darkness. Mlemkutin, Shipvezda Command Center, Mlemsk. 14th November, year 92. 2:11 a.m. The phone rang in the dead of night, Mlemkutin clumsily pawing at the receiver until he finally planted it haphazardly on the ear. Whoever was calling on at this hour better have had something important, especially since it was one of the rare days he could actually afford to get to sleep earlier than 3 in the morning. Sir, I believe you need to see this. Whoever was on the other side of the line had left no other indication of whatever it was worth waking him for, especially with a war going on. Sleep was scarce enough as it was. Still, he was obligated to at least look into whatever this was about, and likely send the offending caller off to a penal battalion if it proved frivolous. To that effect, he pulled on the set of fatigues he managed to excavate from the depths of his wardrobe locker. He uncapped a flask of coffee sat on his nightstand, taking a gulp and lapping up the remainder before he shuffled out the room with it in hand. But the sight before him would require less coffee and more so hard liquor. The enemy fleet projected onto the screen before him, almost leading him to drop the flask entirely. A large number of interplanetary-class troop ships, escorted by several battleships and cruisers. Those too proved peculiar designs. They were suddenly cattle craft, bearing the distinct flourishes and markings the Union had long thought themselves rid of. But there was something different to them, something new. He pulled up the archived intelligence files on the older Caddo spacecraft, gazing upon them with increasing alarm. These designs were new, unprecedented. Your orders, sir. Inform the Admiralty at once. The Grand Fleet must be dispatched to deal with this threat immediately. The Grand Fleet, of course, was nowhere near as grand as its name implied. The initial cargo showing had pummeled a number of ships back into their base for repairs, even destroying the doge Alexander Shipsky. But the Mlemsk base was primarily intended for the collection and dispersal of intelligence, and he couldn't get the ships refit any faster than they already were regardless. He took another sip of the coffee, tail folding slowly between his legs. Comrade Admiral, you had better know what you're doing here. Spicy bad writing. Ooh. Killings. Ship goods outskirts. 9 a.m. The ground shook as the great howitzer let loose in the round. Another gun went off somewhere to his left. Of course, getting the great siege weapons to position had been relatively easy, all things considered. With Soviet space forces stretched as thin as they were, all thanks to Morale's own space forces, or so he had been told anyway, there was many an opportunity to smuggle equipment past the blockade. But the enemy still had tricks up their sleeve, and an unceasing rain of counter-battery fire plunging into their positions. The enemy guns could not be silenced, engaging in shoot-and-scoot tactics the far bulkier cattle guns were ill-suited to. And so they would remain in place, and by the grace of Meow they would withstand the enemy shells. Certainly his Moraelians could, but he was less confident in the Cadites who manned the guns themselves. He had never trusted their capabilities in battle. The training they seemed to so adore could never match the devotion of a true warrior of Meow. But there was no value in questioning the hand with which Meow had dealt him. The first shells were landing in the east. He zoomed in on the shipwright positions with his Imperial mate spotting binoculars. You could say what you liked about the Doge's empire and the strange customs, but they certainly made good equipment. The shells had landed somewhere in the enemy rear, behind the hastily constructed battlements which the shipwrights took shelter in. Perhaps they would do damage, or perhaps they had landed far from anything important. He couldn't tell, but what was done was done. He meddled what the fuck is a quick player, Doge? Does the guy pull out a fucking iPod from his pocket? A quick prayer to Meow before relaying the corrections for the guns. He sighed, breath venting from the ports in his suit, turning to mist in the cold winter air. They would be here for a while, as long as the city kept getting supplies. But they couldn't stop those. The ship with armored trains carrying enough firepower to dislodge the cattle force entirely if they ventured too close to the rails. There was no use shelling the rails either. Their entire length was littered with automatic defenses and anti-ballistic systems. Perhaps if they destroyed the base in Vladivostok. No, that wouldn't stop the shipwrights. The trains would just come from the other direction, and there was no doubt the enemy would fight tooth and nail for their far eastern outpost in any case. Still, it couldn't hurt if we passed the idea up. Perhaps something would come of it if Meow smiled upon them. But until then, it couldn't hurt to send one more scouting force to the rails. Meow had plenty of willing martyrs, and he could always use more intel. Shibanov, somewhere along the Trans-Siberian. 1:24 p.m. Private Borkjani Shibanov glanced at the battered clock hanging at the end of the rail car, held in place with what seemed to be a mix of string and tape. 13:24 hours. He leaned back into his chair, huddling closer to the radiator mounted on the wall. It was a wonder he had a chair at all, but he had been lucky enough to score a converted passenger car. Some of his other comrades had of course been less fortunate, getting boxcars, perhaps even the much maligned converted flat cars. But even with the plus of its passenger transport origins, the car was far from opulent. Only traces of paneling clinging to the walls, but at least it had retained its insulation, a great help in fending off the biting cold of the Siberian wastes. A harsh voice barked a message over the intercom as the train rattled over the tracks. Huh? Dog puns? Hey! Fucking hell. Attention! We are entering territory the enemy has stolen from us. Assume combat positions. Classical Doge, lack of punctuation on the end of the sentence there. Very cool. The troops aboard groaned collectively as they heard the order, retrieving rifles, putting down cards, and cutting short conversations. They were all likely to be shot at any time for all he knew, but at least they weren't defenseless. The armored train which pulled them along had an entire company's worth of firepower at the least, and the car they rode in had enough armor bolted on that they at least felt safe. And if that wasn't enough, they even had their own pair of KBD heavy machine guns set up to fire from the windows. They had been cruising through Catoland for, he looked at the clock again, 15 minutes. No contact yet. Maybe the train's array of weapons would be enough to ward off the Catos. And then it erupted. A Cato rocket slammed into the train's side, its anti-tank warhead easily punching through the carriage's armor. The concussion knocked him against the other wall, barely missing, going out one of the windows. The heavy machine gun roared to life, the car filling with its beat as it spat out rounds. He got back up, rushing to one of the windows and squeezing off a couple of bursts at the Catos. But the enemy buggy was already disintegrating before his eyes, the train's larger guns finding their target. And just like that, silence fell again, broken only by the faint vibrations of the train as it clattered along the rail. Destruction became once again replaced by pristine snow, and they rolled on, maybe a few kilograms of ammunition lighter. He looked himself over. He would be fine. A few scrapes and bruises, nothing broken. Sure, it would hurt in the morning, but he was fine for now. Some of the others less so. One of the trio who had been playing cards earlier lay dead, while another doge had been pierced by a hunk of shrapnel. Medics swarmed in, dragging out the dead and wounded, living but the survivors let themselves. The train rolled on. Barkioni, Officer's Dugout, Shribkutsk. 16th November, year 92. 1:58 p.m. Someone shuts those fucking guns up! Shouted Barkioni. But rather unfortunately for him, shouting wasn't going to knock out the enemy artillery, though it wasn't like anyone could hear him anyway. Once again, courtesy of the Cato artillery. The bombardment had persisted all day long, endlessly pounding at the city center. It had gone on for days now, during comparisons to the Great War of old. Empires long since dead, hurling thousands of shells across its trenches long since buried. Perhaps it wasn't so different now, he mused. After all, there was still a no man's land to be fought over and plenty of lives to throw away for it. He chuckled. Of course it wasn't so different. It was the same damn fight brought into the present day. He kicked absent-mindedly at the dirt walls of the dugout. Maybe he'd managed to dig up some of the famous Imperial gold that he'd heard was around here. Or was it in Bormsk? Hell, could have been both. His thoughts were interrupted, however, by another Cato shell plunging into the earth, bits of dust and soil bouncing off the ground, coming down from the ceiling, drifting, tumbling onto the stack of papers piled up onto his desk. He hoped the engineers had done as good a job as they'd said they'd done. The roof was liable to cave any time if they hadn't. And, with that, the lights which had been haphazardly strung around the excavation promptly went out, the earthworks falling into darkness once again. Swearing profusely, he stood up, blindly grasping for the battered old lantern he kept around for times like this, shuffling out into the cramped network of zigzagging trenches and earthworks, making his way to one of the sheltered observation posts dotting the lines. He emerged from the park just behind the front. The ground beneath around him marked with craters. Not a trace of green remained in the once pristine park grounds, bodies littering the streets shredded by artillery and shrapnel. A statue of Mlemnin lay on its side, decapitated, just another victim of the Cato artillery. Speaking of the Cato artillery, it was about time. Boom. There it was. The shipwright troops had gotten rather used to the enemy timings by now, and the Cato gun crews being remarkably consistent. He dusted himself off, dust and debris falling liberated from his coat. Another shell made impact somewhere to his right. They would really have to deal with that soon. He scurried back into the tunnels below, setting the radio by the dim light, his lantern afforded him. He didn't know how long the batteries in the set would last without power, certainly not long with the sort of transmissions he would have to be making. He phoned into Mlimsk, the radio waves skimming across the atmosphere as they crossed the Siberian wilderness. An annoyed Doge picked up at the other end, clearly unhappy about the interruption. One somewhat heated exchange of words later, Barkioni had his confirmation. The space forces were spread too thin to assist. Air support would not work. He had watched as the surveillance drones were shot down by Cato surface-to-air missiles. The systems had gone up the day prior, after harassment achieved with aircraft both manned and unmanned. And those systems removed both aircraft and remote missile strikes from the equation, the missiles even shooting down some of the ship with counter-battery fire. An armored thrust would likely break through the cattle lines, but what armor they had in the area was far too precious to expend, and the mission likely to yield heavy casualties if attempted. With the resources stretched as thin as they were, their only hope was to dig in and attempt what counter-battery fire they could, get past the cattle defenses, and hope for the best. The Grostovsky, ship with submarine Dorsarka. 19th November, year 92, 2 a.m. The Admiral shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the eyes cracking above the submarine as it surfaced. He peered out the periscope, watching the remains of the ice slowing off the ship's blunt black hull. They had been running quiet since the launch, without orders from command. He supposed that Stavka had been far too busy with the armies and space fleets, that there was no real point in the Blue Water Navy these days. The missile launch had merely been for the sake of convenience. There were 1,000 ground-based silos which could do the same. He glanced. Ahem, Doge, read properly. Get your shit together. He sighed. He had been set to retire at the end of the month. The Navy merged into local commands, the last vestiges of the Union's blue water war fleets fading away. But such was the cost of progress, he supposed. They would always have the museums. But all that could be arranged when the war was over. The radio crackled, spewing noise and static. Then speech, garbled at first. The Grostovsky held the receiver against his ear. He heard a clunk as the calling tower connected with the ice. He tuned it out, concentrating on the radio. All unassigned naval forces to report to Station Ground 4 for further instruction. Sibius to report all on... He put down the radio, addressed the crew. Attention, comrades! We go to Vladivostok. The order had been clear, straight from the Stavka. He wondered if anyone else would be there. He paused, remembering the tales he had been told of the 2nd Eastern Squadron. How long ago had that been? He couldn't remember. Long ago, long enough for it to appear again, for it to happen again. The vessel came under steam, slinking back down into the murky depths, ice drifting back into place above it. Perhaps they would all die in this war. Submarining was a dangerous job, and they didn't know what way to go east. But they could figure it out when they got there. There wasn't anything else to do anyway. So of course, 2nd Eastern Squadron is going to be your obligatory reference to the historical Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, also known as the UC torpedo boats. How much is left in this? Oh shit! This is a chunky boy. It goes all the way to page 43. Where the hell are we right now? Page 38. 5 more pages. We can do this. Mlemskovich, Imperial Cruiser Tsarevich, 19th November, year 92, 8 a.m. Mlemskovich shot a glance at the array of charts which had been scattered around the command station. These were in uncharted territory. What maps that could be found barely skirting the edges of the area. He brought up the newest spread of LiDAR returns. The enemy ship was still there. The Tsarevich had been shadowing it for days now, keeping undetected. For now. Naval intelligence had classified the ship as the Shipvetsky Soyuz, lead ship of a class of space battleships originally constructed in the 3470s. He sighed, sifting through the pile of intelligence reports. Well, not quite as dangerous as the Slavny class which succeeded them. They still marked the pinnacle of ship technology a mere 20 years past, easily capable of beating his crews to a pulp if they got a chance at a fair fight. Which was why he couldn't have let the enemy have a fair fight. Not now, and not ever. He pondered his options. Even if he could outmaneuver the behemoth, he knew he could never hope to outgun it, even with the help of the three Radosny-class cruisers which formed the rest of the squadron. But they had stealth, and they had time. He'd come up with some way to destroy the battleship eventually, he was sure of that. 21st November, year 92. 9:12 p.m. Mlemskovich swept away the report on the screen before him. They had been following the enemy vessel for some time now. 9 days? He had been following the intelligence intercepts with piqued interest, trying to discern what an enemy capital ship was doing unescorted so far from its home port. From what he had seen, it seemed that it was rescuing survivors of the first wave of attacks. Why the Reds would send none of the much-needed battleships for this mission was beyond him. And as for the lack of escort, nobody could tell that either. Perhaps they did not expect major enemy presence in the area. They were fighting Kados after all, for all they knew. But of course, the Admiral had long learned not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Its solitude would make it all the easier for sensor equipment to be disabled, for boarding parties to sneak aboard. But of course, that didn't matter, not when he would have to get into visual identification range. Perhaps the destroyers would have a better chance of getting close. No, their jammers were weaker, low power, short range, shorter than that of the enemy lasers. They would be torn to shreds. That then left him but one option: find something large enough to obscure his own ship until he could get close. They would be able to scramble the enemy's sensors then, knock out their targeting systems, turn the enemy ship defenseless. Finding that something had been easy enough, the shadow of the enemy ship eclipsing that of his own. A bigger issue, of course, was his enemy energy emissions. The ship couldn't run in low power mode while moving, and the enemy ship would likely be spooked into battle stations by any abnormal readings. They could come from behind then, his ship blending into the noisy signatures of the ship's exhaust. That would also conveniently place him into its shadow, allowing for a stealthy approach. He could camouflage his magnetic signature by posing as an asteroid escaping the belt. That was all well and good, but moving to the enemy's exhaust would blast the ship with a constant stream of charged particles the enemy's ship's engines gave out. It had not turned to enter its slowdown burn yet, and the inefficient ship propulsion systems left more than enough energy in its exhaust to strip the paint off his ship, or worse, fry his own electronics. But of course, wars were not won without taking risks, and the rewards of taking an entire ship-with battleship were more than enough to justify the bet. He placed a paw to his chest, silently mouthing the phrase he had spoken so many times before: "I'll be with you, for better or worse." Purran, Cattle flagship Bastat, coordinates unknown. 22nd November, year 92, 2 p.m. Confessor? Yes, High Confessor. Your bombardment of ship goods has continued for 2 weeks. That is an awfully long time for the kind of war we fight here. When can we expect results? High Confessor, the lines of the infidel are almost broken, and we shall make our move in 3 more days. We shall crush them with the wrath of Meow. We shall... Click. Perrin set down the ornately carved earpiece, offhand idly toying with a ball of yarn. Mrawites were always such pains to deal with their worship in pointless formalities. But it was necessary for now, she supposed. Their numbers were vital for the invasion's success, an endless supply of fanatical meat shields. But they would have to be dealt with eventually, when Cade would have to take back their own. But there was a war to win first, and the Mrawites were failing at even this. Twirling the now unraveled ball of yarn in an outstretched claw, she lifted the receiver once again. If you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself, or get the Cadian to. "Come in, Major Lion, come in." There was a brief pause before the advocate cleared the throat in response. "Yes, Commander," Leon reporting. "That Mrawite fool has taken enough time already. Do whatever you must to achieve victory, and do it now. 2 more Cadian battalions have been added to your force for this purpose." Another short pause. "It shall be done, Commander." I don't remember. Could have sworn we didn't, change the fucking plural of this shit to Cadeite, but inconsistency is always fun. Probably just had screwed it up in the great rewrite. She placed the receiver back into its cradle yet again, the remains of the yarn slowly floating towards the floor. If they played their cards right, they could finally claim the rightful place as masters of the system. But failure could just as easily be disastrous. Perhaps with enough planning and just a bit of luck, they could finally turn the tables. Shibilov, Shibikovaradrum, Leningrad. 17:53 hours. Shibilov checked his watch. The delivery was early for once. The damaged Doglianitsa cargo zeppelin slowly descended from the sky, the thrumming of its engines turning deafening as it entered the hangar. He put on his earplugs, the foam expanding and making the noise just a bit more bearable. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft as it neared the ground, throwing mooring lines and shouting orders. The zeppelin hangar's armored roof closed with a heavy clunk. The colossal chamber plunged momentarily into darkness until floodlights turned on, their electric hums taking the place of the airship's engines. He pulled out the earplugs, placing them back into his coat pocket. The airship's cargo door hit the ground, disgorging its cargo of tanks and supplies. He barked orders over the rumbling and clanking which now filled the space, the vehicle slowly rolling out of the heavy lift ship. The DMP-52 IFVs and DT-471 tanks represented newest achieved armor, hastily flown from the production centers further east to support the city's defenders. They were a welcome addition, especially with the increased numbers of cattle armor in the area. The new armor was unproven, but it would be a welcome addition, especially compared to the obsolete museum pieces they had to resort to in the meantime. A set of air stairs popped open with a hydraulic hiss, the craft's beleaguered pilots walking towards him, shrugging off their heavy flight jackets as they approached. Commander Shibrov, 2nd Guards Division? Lieutenant, actually. Is supposed to receive the delivery of these tanks. Duh. And with that, the pilot saluted, turned, and tramped off towards the base bar, leaving Shibrov and his unit to unload the tanks alone. 23rd November, year 92, 8:43 a.m. Shibrov wiped himself down with a torn-up rag, a vain attempt to get the oil stains out of his fur. They had worked through the night, finally getting the tanks offloaded and running. He patted the hull of his tired old DT-96, directing the driver to return it to the vehicle depot he had found it in, for it would be defueled and returned to storage, as much as he had gone through with the old beast. It was a museum piece, and he was happy to leave it back where it belonged. Maybe they could even add a new plaque to the display. He fished out a cigarette from his pockets, lighting it as he stepped outside. He took a long drag as he relished the view, the cold, crisp winter air mingling with the faint grey smoke filling of the cigarette's lit end. The aerodrome felt empty, with all commuter flights suspended since the start of the war. A handful of Air Service doge stood on the runway, fueled and ready for takeoff, while another doge needed to orbit the skies above as it waited for landing clearance. Still, it felt wrong. The silent passenger terminal was almost uncanny. He turned his gaze west, taking another puff as he looked upon the smoldering ruins of Dorstadt port across the Gulf. He had watched as the first cattle bombs had come down so many weeks ago, razing dockyards and buildings which had survived countless wars and battles. But, of course, nothing was ever completely safe these days. Not anymore. Stomping out the cigarette on the concrete, he turned, making his way back to the base they had established inside the city. He needed some rest. They all did. Vovskovin, unnamed military base, Vladimir outskirts, former Gabelandia. 24th November, year 92, 2:49 a.m. Private Shiblery Voskovin. Check the click, Check the click. What the fuck is the click? Yeah, Doge, I think you mean the clock. The clock which had been bolted into the wall before him. 10 more minutes until the next watch would relieve him. 10 more minutes until he could get some rest. He tried to stay awake just a bit longer, wondering why he'd been posted to this forsaken outpost in the middle of some Gabelandian pit of despair, all while the Rodina itself was invaded. Some damnable member of the local fauna chirped away in his ear. It was only a bit longer, he told himself. Maybe he could get some sleep then, or at least not be crammed in this stupid tower. Just 10 more minutes. Just 10 more minutes. Just 10 more minutes. And the night erupted, the sounds of the night drowned out by reports of automatic gunfire, rocket launchers streaked through the dark, trailing smoke and fire, blowing asunder anything short of a solid concrete wall. It wasn't long until the Soviets returned fire, the snaps and crackles of their actual lasers joining the constant bang, bang, bang of the enemy rifles in the cacophony, arcing bursts crossing the air in reply. He ducked as a burst of fire tore through the watchtower's sheet steel walls. Grabbing his rifle, he leaned against the shut-up wall as he flipped off the safety, breathing heavily. He rose, looking through what remained of a window. The yard below was already slowly filling with whatever backwater insurgents had stormed the place. He shouldered his rifle, firing into the throng. 1 down, 2 down, aim. He heard the distinct whoosh of a rocket launcher, saw the jet of flame, a flash of light. Then, darkness. An unknown time later. Everything hurt. He had woken against a tree, to the light of the slowly rising sun. His weapon was gone, probably sent to orbit by the explosion which had seemingly brought him here. The ruins of the base stood a flaming wreck merely a short distance away, plumes of fire and smoke still reaching skyward. He groaned as he tried to crawl upright, and managed to get up. Just. Nothing felt broken, fortunately. Maybe. Ah, that was it. His arm was dislocated. Clenching his teeth, he put whatever he remembered of his rudimentary medical training to use. The insurgents, terrorists, rebels, whatever you wanted to call them, whatever they wanted to be called, had already retreated into the forest. He slowly made his way back into the base, carefully watching for traps. He tried his radio. Dead. Unsurprising, he supposed, especially considering the circumstances. A machine gun hung limply at the entrance to the base, a gaping hole punched into its receiver by an enemy bullet. He walked closer, smelled death. Burning smoke. Looked closer, felt sick. The attackers had piled higher the shivering corpses, stripped of clothing, anything useful, set the pile on fire. He wondered where they got the fuel from. Combustible liquids are rare these days, mostly the domain of the Air Force and select elite army units. There was a pile of AS-H-55 service rifles outside the barracks building, a makeshift termite bomb planted but detonated. He looked them over. The guns were busted, seemingly having either been caught in the explosion or shot through. He checked the armory. It was empty. The enemy had probably made off with anything that was left in there anyway. The enemy had left none of their own dead, however. Wherever the ones he had shot had went, he did not know. Seemingly no real trace remained of their presence, well, except the destroyed outpost. But there wasn't much information that could be salvaged from that. Wait, what was that? He looked closer. A chunk of metal, basked in the warm glow of the fires. It looked vaguely in the shape of a rifle receiver, but it was missing a number of parts. Perhaps they had been stripped off before it was abandoned. The receiver itself was a goner. It had, like so many others, taken a hit. But it didn't look shivved. It had been heavily damaged, but there was just enough left for him to make some markings. Novaya Tula 5213. 3 space 92 G. And once again, we have completed a slightly chunkier than one chapter, which has no actual, real direction. It sort of just exists. Anyway, tune in for the next one eventually. We've gone through like 44 out of 73 pages, which is spicy. Anyway, this recording is at approximately 1 hour, so I'm going to screw off now. Farewell. Hopefully the recording actually worked properly and I did not miss 20 minutes of the fucking recording this time. Cheerio.